Thank you for joining us for the next hour or two in this episode of Insight Myanmar podcast. In an age of nearly limitless content, we appreciate that you're choosing to take valuable time out of your day to learn more about what is happening in Myanmar. It is vital for this story to continue to be heard by people around the world, and that starts right now with you.
I had a dream of bullets flying across fields, of bombs raining down the sky, of children in flames, and their charred remains. Then my eyes flung open, and I realized the nightmare was not over.
I'm really pleased on this episode of Insight Myanmar podcast to be speaking to Erin Murphy, who just released a book called Burmese Haze, which we'll talk about. So, Erin, thanks so much for joining us on this episode.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Right. So we have a lot to get through with your book. It's really chock full of a lot of stuff that's really relevant to the current moment and trying to understand that a bit better. Before we get to your actual book, I want to talk just a moment about your background, a couple things that stand out. First is a similarity that we share, almost share. You were a JET English teacher in Japan. I was almost a JET. I had a sister city program with my small liberal arts school in Oregon that had me associated with the JETs, but we both had our introduction to Asia through teaching English in Japan. So that was the first thing that brought you over to the region. Eventually you came over to Myanmar. You also worked as a CIA analyst for some time. So just before we get into Myanmar, if you could just touch upon your experiences with JET and Japan and how that made you perhaps more aware of the area. And then I think probably a lot of people are curious about what one does as a CIA analyst.
I'm sure. I think they would say the easiest way to find out is to join, but that's not an option for everyone, of course. JET was my first foray into Asia. JET stands for Japan Exchange and Teaching. And I had always wanted a career in international relations. I wanted a career where I could travel and really see the world. So I initially started off as, really focused on Europe, which, East Coast American isn't. I majored in Spanish. It was a language I had started studying in middle school or, sixth grade. On through college, and I was like, I'm going to go to Europe and it's going to be fantastic. But that was before the Euro days, so that dates me a bit. But there really weren't going to be any jobs for Americans. So the JET program and the Peace Corps, they really recruited heavily from my undergrad. So I was like, I'm going to do this Japan thing. Everyone seems to be focused on China. I'll do Japan. This will be my introduction to Asia, and boy, was it. And I'm sure you were also in a very rural area. I was in the South, and it was really fascinating. I really highly recommend for any listeners who are on the younger side, especially, get out there. Your tolerance level for travel and bizarre things happening to you is so much higher than when you get older. But from there, definitely got the bug for Asia, saw it as a really strategic area for the U.S., but also for international relations writ large, economically, militarily, diplomatically. So went to grad school, went to the School for Advanced International Studies, where econ is a big, heavy focus for everyone, and did Japan studies, and then joined the CIA as an analyst, thinking I'd be working on alliance issues, and instead I got put on like a very tiny account that no one paid attention to, still in the region. But being an analyst is really interesting. It's excellent training, I think, for almost any career that you get into, because you are trained on briefing techniques and writing skills, analytic skills, all of which are, I think, really important. So as an analyst, you look at all sources, unclassified, which could be your newspapers, think tank reports, stuff like that. Classified information, which I think everyone thinks is the most exciting. And it's just putting together a story, just kind of understanding what happens. And I think, what also helps make you a good analyst is having experience in the field. So you understand what happens in countries, how they make decisions, and, because obviously Americans make decisions different ways. So trying to bridge that gap of understanding so that the U.S. makes good decisions, and that the decisions that the U.S. policymakers make are received the way that it's intended on the other side, whether that's a positive or a negative. So while I was an analyst, I got pulled on to the Myanmar issue just weeks before Cyclone Nargis. And that's what really kind of got me hooked on Myanmar, and I've been working on it ever since. So for those that aren't familiar with, Cyclone Nargis happened in May 2008, which seems like a lifetime ago. And I've been working on Myanmar in some capacity or another ever since.
Thanks for that. So that brings us to Myanmar, and you start your book off before getting into the last 10 years of history by recognizing that Myanmar holds a certain kind of fascination for people from a number of different groups. And you go on to list the different audiences and what Myanmar means to them and their imagination and kind of exoticism. I would actually even go further back than the short snapshot you gave of like the Orientalism of the last 150 years or so, and just reading old British colonial writings and whatnot. As we talked about before the call, I came to Myanmar from Japan, from starting a Burmese meditation practice that I found in Japan, the Vipassana movement of S.N. Goenka. And it definitely, among meditators, among that crowd, which was my initial entry, and then it expanded into so much more, it was definitely held as this kind of spiritual homeland, this special golden land that very conveniently removed of politics, one can say, was unchanging with the way the practice was carried down and the tradition of Buddhism and monkhood. But getting back to your excerpt and what you wrote, why was it important to frame your work by recognizing and highlighting this kind of exotic feeling that many different groups had when they looked at Myanmar, which is kind of more, as you read that, is kind of more of a symptom of how one feels about something and the role it has in one's mind and imagination than the thing itself. So why was that important to frame the pages in the book that followed?
Well, I want to highlight the exoticism and the Orientalism that tends to happen in Myanmar, because I wanted to get that out of the way and make sure that people just didn't see this as some sort of Shangri-La, that everything is so magical there that you miss what's in front of you, which is also magical and very interesting, but that there's real pain here and real history. And, it's been the site of so many important events, and that you need to kind of see beyond the exoticism, because when you look at that, then it doesn't make Myanmar real. It doesn't make the people real. And then it makes it very easy to gloss over what's in front of your face. You see that in Cuba to some extent as well, where, folks really wanted to go there when it started opening up to Americans. And they're so fascinated by, these cars from the 1950s and things frozen in time. And it's like, well, why is it frozen in time? It's because we put it there. That's not exciting for the Cubans, nor is being objectified this way in Myanmar great for them either. Sure, it brings attention, but then you don't really scratch the surface to see what you're doing or what you're seeing. And when you do scratch the surface, it just makes it so much better, I think. So I wanted to make sure that I wasn't contributing to the literature of saying, oh, exotic Myanmar. I went in there and I was like, some sort of white
Mm-hmm.
savior, some magical, what a beautiful land. You have to get beyond that. You can't objectify this country. And, you see that a lot. So it was
Yeah.
important for me to kind of say, yeah, this is super interesting, but there's so much more beyond, and it deserves a better treatment than that.
Yeah, and I think it was also good just to acknowledge that reality, to name the thing that's there as something that contributes to understanding what that is. It's kind of like the old physics thing that as you get deeper into physics, just simply by observing something, you change the nature of what it is you're observing. So looking at who the observer is, I think, is important in that regard. And through this conversation, we're going to talk about the factors and conditions from the previous decade that led to the coup taking place, how this informs us as we navigate through this ongoing coup and resistance to the military regime. But before starting at the beginning of the book, I actually want to focus at the end. In your acknowledgments, it struck me that you mentioned now SAC Foreign Minister Wunamang Lwin and Vice Admiral Sothane and Tonang Man. You noted that it was a different time when you spoke to them and when you interviewed, and reminded them of the progress that was achieved during the transition years, while calling on them to prevent Myanmar from sliding deeper into darkness. What was it like to hold these men in mind when you were writing this historical account from another time, another era, even though it was just a couple of years ago, while realizing that they're also now involved in this current terrible state of affairs?
Yeah, I did it in part because, they were ultimately good soldiers. And when I say good soldiers, is that they follow orders. And, if you read the book and you see what, the foreign minister, Wunamang Lwin, was doing during the time of Secretary Clinton's visit, and increasingly positive relationships between Myanmar and the U.S., it was partly under duress, I think, for him, and mostly under orders because that's what Thein Sein told him to do. And I was hoping to speak to at least some part of them that saw what the benefit of this was. I mean, I think there were parts of them that really appreciated not being a pariah anymore, to be celebrated, to be invited to things, not to be yelled at, but to be praised for what they were doing. And, whether they were doing it out of the goodness of their hearts, I don't think that should matter as much, but that it was being done. And, we certainly weren't, and when I say we, I'm kind of referencing my time in the US government and also for the policymakers. I mean, certainly there were those folks that I think were a little too optimistic about where this was going to go. And, as soon as Wunamang Lwin was like, okay, we're going to release a couple of political prisoners, some folks were like, okay, ready, let's fully normalize relationships. Whereas others were a lot more cautious, didn't build in that trust, knew that these guys were part of a military apparatus and a governing structure that was ultimately a problem. Mm-hmm. And so, I spent a lot of time with all three of them, both while I was in government, when I was a consultant, and then as I was writing this book, I spent hours with them, interviewing them for this book. I remember going to Naypyidaw to meet with Wunamang Lwin about this. And I mean, he was a USDP apparatchik through and through, he wanted to see the military in strength. So I didn't hold out much hope from him. And I wasn't surprised at all that he joined the SAC. But Sothane is a bit more of a disappointment. And Tonang Man, I mean, this is a guy who almost ended up in jail during a USDP party purge when his father, Shui Man, was lost his role within the party. And they were surrounded by, military police and whatnot. So I think there's also a sense of self-preservation, which is, I can understand from a certain level. And, we're not experiencing what they are, where we could be thrown in jail as well,
right,
and have everything taken away from us. So I think that there should be a certain amount of sympathy there, or empathy, not too much, but, so I called on them because they know influential people. They know what it was like to be pariah, to praise, back again. And was there any part of them? I mean, they could have a legacy as well. So, where do you want to be in history? And I think everything that's happened since the coup, really erases any positive momentum or acknowledgement that they had. So I felt it's such a small thing for me to do. I don't expect that they're going to pick up this book, but if in the hopes that they do, that they see that.
Right. Let's hope so for sure. One of the things that stands out in reading your book was just how well researched the American side was. And as an American who was living through these years and sometimes side by side or under some of the people that you talk about, it was really amazing to see some of these details come to light that I had lived through and never seen in print. And then other details that I didn't know were actually happening while I was living through it. And we had a talk with the historian Kenton Clymer a couple months ago with his book studying the history of U.S.-Burma relations, and he kind of leaves off right around where you pick up, which was really, I think, interesting for me and interesting for readers that these two books together can form a pretty good timeline from World War II. And there's a lot of small details you include in yours. I mean, you talk about things that just put some puzzle pieces together that I didn't know, or maybe I knew one time and I forgot, just little things like Hillary Clinton had a Burmese roommate in law school and that put it on the radar for her, or Derek Mitchell got introduced through an aide in Senator Kennedy's office in 1992, and he read Aung San Suu Kyi's book, Freedom from Fear. Even little things like when they were flying suddenly from Korea to Myanmar, having to somehow find a dog treat or a dog snack because Aung San Suu Kyi liked dogs and they wanted to find a gift and all the shops in Korea were closed. Those kinds of stuff are really great to be able to get that level of detail. So I'm wondering, in your process of gathering the interviews that you did, you were, and I should mention, in juxtaposition to Kenton and the research he did, he was having to go through archives and he was dealing with a history that had been long past. People were no longer living in many cases and had to go through. And he also did an excellent job of being able to show how different American officials were seeing things at different times, at different moments of Burmese history and of their relations. And you're doing something similar in the last decade. So you're actually being able, unlike him, you actually are able to go and talk to people who lived through that period and get many more of those small details that maybe wouldn't even have been written down in documents. So what was the process like in being able to conduct those interviews? How open and willing were people to talk? And how did you get that kind of access?
Yeah, it was, it was deliberate and intentional, and seeing the books that had already come out, there was no need for my book to retread. And I think that because I had such a unique front row seat to what was happening, that I could tell those stories and get those details so that someone doesn't have to go into dusty old archives later and actually get this. And why I sourced it so carefully as well. So, that you could see there was content and context behind it. I think the interviews, my idea when I first started writing the book, because to decide you're going to write a book, one is a heady, borderline narcissistic thing.
Right.
Especially if you're not like a PhD or in academia. So, I had to get around the ego thing. I thought it was an important story that could be told. Again, I had the time to be able to do it and the resources to be able to do it as well. And I thought, Derek Mitchell, I'm sure, could write an incredible book, but he's a very busy guy. And, Clinton did dedicate a chapter in her book, Hard Choices, to it, to the Burma issue. But, is she going to go out and start interviewing folks for it? I don't think so. So, what started is, I had worked with a lot of the folks, like the staffers for Senator Webb, with Secretary Clinton's team, with Derek Mitchell. And I would tell them, I was thinking about writing this book. I would really like to interview, Senator Webb if he is interested. Let's do it. And everyone kept saying yes. And so as people started saying yes, it gave me momentum to write this book and to get that encouragement that this is a story that should be told. I interviewed Secretary Clinton. I was told I had 20 minutes. She sat with me for an hour. We also took a picture together because, when are you going to get that opportunity?
Yeah.
I had also worked with Mitch McConnell's staff for years on this issue. So again, like I was just, the worst I could hear was no to my request, but everyone kept saying yes. I think there were only a handful that didn't, less than a handful. And one was because they didn't want to relive that time. It was too sad for them. And others that were just so incredibly busy that, they just didn't have the time, but wished me well and pointed me in other directions. So even the folks that said no were helpful in directing me to archives like the Ronald Reagan Library or the Bush Institute, or to other people who were with them at the time. Like, for example, First Lady Laura Bush, her office, again, wished me well and pointed me in the direction of folks that worked with the First Lady or had been covering that time. So, everyone was really helpful. And so that was really encouraging. I think for a lot of folks, and, if you work on issues like this, it was a bit of a catharsis to be able to talk about the time and also just swap notes. And, I had a lot of folks ask, like, well, what did they say about this? What happened? Was I crazy in thinking like that was what was happening at the time? And one interview that stood out to me and was really early on was with Admiral Tim Keating, who was the PACOM lead during Cyclone Nargis. And, he just, in his mind, sometimes it's almost like it was a dream or a nightmare, depending on what aspect you're coming from. But I was heading to Myanmar after our interview, and that was when I was going to interview Winamung Win and So Thane. And he's like, could you ask them questions for me? Because I'd really be interested to know, like, did we make a difference at all? Like, did this matter? Do you remember me? So, I was able also to be a conduit in some ways. The sad part was they didn't give a shit about what the U.S. did, at least to those two. And apologies if this is a family-friendly broadcast.
No, go ahead. Express yourself.
But yeah, so it was a lot of interviews. I had a wonderful research assistant who loves to do this sort of thing. So she was going through the New Light of Myanmar archives, which,
oh, that's fun.
Like learning about the four causes and, hearing about what stooges we were and Sky Full of Lies.
And the new dam that gets built.
Oh, yes. And it is learned and all this other good stuff. But it was, the interviews were my favorite part. I love engaging with people and hearing their stories. And I think, in some ways, I thought adding stories into this rather than being just like a hardcore academic treatise of what happened brought the story to life in a little way, but also added credibility to the people who worked on it so that you could see their interest went beyond just the surface, that there had always been some spark of Myanmar within them, and that, they took their own time to learn more about it. So, that's what makes successful policy, I think, if you have people with that experience. And I want to show that as well, that you didn't have a bunch of amateurs just showing up who was like, oh, what's this, Burmamar? That they
cared. So getting into some of the characters that are key players at this time, at least on the American side, if we can just do a quick run through with their bio, just because we'll be saying these names as we go along, and these are people that were important in the decisions that were made during the transition period and during the years that you cover. So if you can just tell us a bit about the following names, a bit of background on their biography and their perspective. We have Scott Marshall, Derek Mitchell, Mitch McConnell, Jim Webb, and some people might know those names. Then a lesser known name that becomes very important, Tom
Malinowski.
Okay, Tom Malinowski. If you could just give some background of these people and why they were important.
Sure. So I'll start with the first. It's Scott Marshall, and he was the ambassador after Derek Mitchell, who I'll talk about as well. He was there, and trying to think of when Derek left, but he had been a long time Burma hand as well. He was a career foreign service officer. During the opening, he was also the ambassador to Indonesia, which was a key player during that time of the opening. They were major player in ASEAN, the Association for Southeast Asian Nations. They were very involved in the Cyclone Nargis recovery effort. And so Jakarta was also the place where the ASEAN embassy, our U.S. mission to ASEAN, was located. So he was kind of dual-hatted in working with our ASEAN representative and with him. So he had a lot of experience from the ASEAN perspective of working with Myanmar. And during the 80s, he had worked on Southeast Asia desks, so was also very familiar with Southeast Asia. So all of that led to his experience when he became ambassador. I believe it was in 2016. So he was there as things started to go south. The Rohingya crisis, the kind of stalemate between the NLD and the military, not great governance, et cetera, et cetera. And he was also there for the ultimate lifting of sanctions as well, which that was in 2016, which was still at that time fairly controversial. So he played a large role. He is now based in Stanford University, very nice, and is also writing a book about Burma. So stay tuned on that. Derek Mitchell, he is a long-time Asia watcher. He used to say that his head was in Northeast Asia, but his heart was in Myanmar. And as you mentioned earlier, he started working on the issue when he was in Ted Kennedy's office. And then he worked for the National Democratic Institute, NDI, which he is now the president of, that did a lot of work on prisoners of conscience and the 88 uprising. And so he worked on a documentary to bring more attention to the cause. So he started working on that issue in the 80s. So like the first major round of protests since the first coup in 1962. And so was sort of baptized by fire in that era. And then from there, he had focused his career mostly on Asia, again, Northeast Asia primarily. He worked at the Pentagon, a think tank called the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And then he was eventually tapped to be the first appointed special representative and policy coordinator for Burma. And that he was appointed in 2011. And it was that time that we saw everything change in the country, and he was not just had a front row seat, but was flying the plane. It seems he eventually became our first ambassador, fully credentialed ambassador. We downgraded diplomatic ties after the 1990 election was not recognized, and he's been following the issue really ever since. Some of the other folks, I've probably forgotten some of the names. Tom Malinowski. He is a congressman right now for the great state of New Jersey, but he's been a long-time activist on Burma. He spent a lot of time there as a student in the 80s. He was also working on Capitol Hill and brought attention to the Myanmar issue. He had the benefit of working with others in that office that knew of the Myanmar issue, so brought it to the attention of Senator Moynihan. So during the 88 uprising, Tom will claim that he was the one that brought Myanmar to the attention of the U.S. government. I think others are claiming that as well. But during the 88 uprising, there were people with signs on the streets of Yangon that said, "Thank you, Senator Moynihan." So he was one of the first senators to speak out against the atrocities happening in the country. So I'm sure I'm missing other players that you mentioned. Any others? Oh, Kurt Campbell is one as well. He was the assistant secretary. He's a personality. He was with the State Department during the opening. He was the assistant secretary for East Asia Pacific. There were other luminaries that have held that role, including Richard Holbrooke and Paul Wolfowitz. So it's a storied role, but he started in that role in 2009 and helped lead the Burma policy review that Secretary Clinton called for to see the sanctions weren't working, but whatever ASEAN was doing wasn't working either. What can we do? So he led that and had one of the first high-level visits to the country in years and years and years by the State Department. So he played an outsized role during the opening. He's currently now at the White House as a special coordinator for Indo-Pacific issues. So Myanmar is still on his radar, but it's interesting that he started that role about a week before the coup. So he's there at both the opening and the close. So, it's certainly come full circle for him as well.
Right. Yeah. A couple other on there were just McConnell and Webb.
Yes. Senator McConnell has also been working on the issue since the 80s. One of his staffers brought the attention of Aung San Suu Kyi's plight and the protests going on, and he just became enamored with the issue and had been, he was more of a junior senator then, which is hard to believe. He's been in the Senate forever, but he has kept a light shining on the issue, whether through floor statements, legislation, trips. Had always been a longtime supporter of Aung San Suu Kyi, even as her star started to fade after the Rohingya crisis. When she came to visit Washington, D.C. and the United States in general, I think she went to 10 cities, including Louisville, Kentucky. They have an Aung San Suu Kyi chair at the University of Kentucky. So he was able to bring her there. But he's been a long time watcher of Myanmar. And then finally, Senator Webb. He's a real interesting person on this. And I think in many ways got lost to history on this. He took a lot of chances very early. And to say that, when I mentioned these folks that have been working on it since the 80s, it was really on the human rights side, condemning the junta. Not that Webb did not, but the idea of engagement was just a third rail, just completely unappealing, was a career killer. And, he took his experience from Vietnam. He was a Marine. He is a Marine. He's retired. Let me be clear. Before the military comes after me, you never leave. You just retire.
Right.
And had fought in Vietnam, but was really one of the key people in terms of helping normalize that relationship. He spent a lot of time with the diaspora community here, and wanted to do something similar with Myanmar. So a lot of similarities. Had taken some trips out there. He's like a Renaissance man. He was a journalist, Marine, author, boxer, senator, presidential candidate. So, I think one of his most well-known trips was in 2009 when he went and was the most senior U.S. official to have met the junta, the then leader, Senior General Than Shwe, the entire State Peace and Development Council. It was a controversial trip, but he felt it was necessary. He also had good timing in that he was there to pick up John Yatta, the American who swam across the lake and got Aung San Suu Kyi another 2 years in prison or on house arrest. So, but from that time, he was very supportive of Derek Mitchell and his efforts, led a lot of hearings on the issue, and basically was very supportive of the opening and did whatever he could to help support that. After 2012, his story sort of gets lost, where you hear more about Clinton, McConnell, Obama. So I think that there's some, he took a lot of barbs from the human rights community, and doesn't really get, I think, as much credit as he deserves on what he was able to do.
Thanks for that rundown of all the people, and we'll be returning to their stories as we tell the wider story of Myanmar. And in your book, that wider story of Myanmar begins with Nargis, with Cyclone Nargis, and as you referenced, in May 2008, I believe it was. And you talk about the story of Nargis in one chapter. And after dedicating this chapter to Nargis and the aftermath, then go on to the rest of the story of the transition. Why was it important to begin your book and begin the story that you tell by picking up from Nargis?
Well, partly for me, Nargis was how I got started. But I think it was also an incredibly pivotal moment for the country, for some of the members of the junta, for aid and local civil society organizations, and just how Myanmar hit rock bottom, although now they seem to be going to a different rock bottom. But I was told by my management, because I've been poking around for, again, from a professional aspect, more to do something interesting, an account that had attention. So there was going to be a constitutional referendum, which is one of the states, the steps of the roadmap to discipline flourishing democracy that Kinyunt, the former military intelligence chief, created in the 90s after the failed 1990 election. And so this was supposed to be the constitution that was going to lead the country towards its most disciplined and most flourishing democracy. The vote was baked. We knew what the result was going to be. It was going to pass with flying colors. Mm-hmm. But I was just to watch it in case there was going to be any violence. Any vote in Myanmar, which there hadn't been since 1990, was usually a cause for concern. Always expecting violence, more arrests and whatnot. So I was just basically kind of keeping watch. So 2 weeks after I had started looking at things, there was this storm a-brewing out in the ocean, and it looked like it was going to be on a normal course to go up, the coast of the west coast of Myanmar, Upper Rakhine State, or hit Bangladesh. But it took a hard right turn and stalled all over the Delta, including Yangon, and just destroyed the place. It erased the Delta from maps. It killed more than 100,000 people, injured so many others, displaced thousands and thousands more. And the callousness of the junta's response, I think, reminded everyone of how terrible this regime was. And the previous year, about 9 months earlier, there was the 2007 so-called saffron uprising, even though Myanmar monks don't wear saffron-colored robes, they wear maroon. But, President Bush was watching that, had imposed a lot of hardcore sanctions after that. But Nargis kind of brought it to another level where this junta, we were offering aid. The United States was offering aid. Again, I think everyone was clear how devastating this was. NASA had pictures of the devastation that were public. And we just got a sense of what it was. And of course, the embassy on the ground was telling us how bad it was just in Yangon. So we can only imagine how bad it was in the Delta. Any aid that we offered was denied and rejected. And that was kind of the case for almost any Western country. Any aid that they did allow in had to be dropped off at Yangon Airport, and then the military would take it from there, which we knew wasn't going to reach the folks in the Delta. But just the callousness of the junta, I think, really drove home who we were dealing with. I mean, the fact, I don't know if it was Sothain or others, but he repeated this to me in that, his sense was those many years later, the Myanmar people can deal with anything. They could survive on rainwater and frogs. And I was like, come on, are you serious? So they were just letting people starve and die. I think this had tested the UN's patience, ASEAN patience. And I think what it really did was to bring the UN and ASEAN together to start working in an apolitical way to deal with Myanmar. Because what are you going to do? It's a Myanmar problem. The cyclone had hit Thailand, but had, not nearly the impact that you saw in the South. So got them to work together. For Thein Sein, I think it was, who was the then prime minister and then future president. For him, it hit him in a different way, in that this was his hometown that had been basically wiped off the map. And, just coming off 9 months earlier from seeing Buddhist monks murdered in the streets. And this was someone who was devout. And so, he was put in charge of the efforts, the aid and recovery efforts. And I think he probably saw, kind of sanitized version of what happened, but I'm sure he got a sense of what the actual devastation was and the callousness of his colleagues and what they were doing. But eventually US aid was allowed in. We flew in with huge C-130s with tons of supplies. And I think the most important thing for the junta is that we did what we said we would, which was we land, we drop off supplies, and we leave. Their concern was we land, we invade. Right. There was a real concern about that, but we did not do this. This was also a chance for civil society organizations to prove themselves. They had much better connections, knew where to go, much better than any of the international NGOs. And this was important, I think, again, whether it's racism or bias or whatnot, that no one really trusted their capabilities, kind of thought they were rinky-dink operations, but in fact, really proved themselves at this time. That they should be included in whatever the UN and ASEAN were doing, and that they could be relied upon. And I think that made a lot of difference going forward. So when the openings started happening, a lot of these, I would say, infrastructure or institutions were in place and had been proven that they were able to mobilize and maybe move the opening in a direction of no return a lot faster than would have happened otherwise. So, I think it was just an incredibly pivotal time and a pivotal event, both for myself just personally, but I think also for the country.
Yeah, yeah. And of all the chapters, this is the one that most closely mirrors my personal lived experience. I remember I had an intensive training course at the American Center before Nargis hit, and the PAO came to me kind of wide-eyed on whatever, I don't remember what day of the week it was, but whatever day it was that afternoon, saying, you might not be able to have class tomorrow. There's this, and I could just tell by the way she was talking that there was something she knew that she was wrestling with whether or not to tell me or how to tell me. And it was only looking back on it later that I realized that she was having access to certain kind of satellite or radar imagery and was seeing something that no one else saw at the time. So I went to my students in the class and said, well, I hear there's this big storm coming that apparently the embassy is saying isn't really well known in the country, but we might not have class. And after some weeks later, when we eventually did return, my students confided in me that at first they thought it was just really cute that this American had never gone through a monsoon season before, and that I was just really kind of being dramatic about my first monsoon. And so they were all kind of like, oh, okay, yeah, we get these monsoons, but there was simply no warning of what was coming. And I woke up at like 5 a.m. to my apartment being literally destroyed. I was in the corner, the upper corner on the top of the apartment building where the winds hit from two directions, and so I woke up to the roof starting to come off and the rain seeping through, and the walls were literally breathing in and out. I mean, not breathing; they were huffing and puffing. And I opened the door, and there's debris, huge debris flying all through the lobby area of the apartment where I was staying, and there's loose wires all around and pools of water. It was terrifying just for me personally, just how I was on the 10th floor, how I possibly get out of there with, the apartment being ripped to shreds and, just debris and loose wires inside. I eventually made it downstairs breathlessly and just with a backpack of my valuables, and told the people in the lobby, you have to evacuate. It's really, this whole thing's being torn apart. Another bit of humor in that time. With complete calmness, the person behind the counter says, oh, don't worry. As soon as the storm clears, we'll send room service to take care of things. And I said, no, that's not what I'm saying. This, because it was so much more intense at the top 10th floor than the bottom lobby. I said, no, you don't understand. There's not going to be any room to do room service in. But as it happened, my particular apartment was of, 100 rooms or so. There was the only one destroyed. It was just right where the winds hit. So downstairs, they didn't really have an understanding how bad it was. But once we walked around, it was more. There were more intense scenes that I witnessed than being in a movie. There were massive concrete signboards like on the road that had been torn out by the roots, whatever you call the roots of a signpost. There were sidewalks that were torn up, cars lifted over. There were, as many people know, all these old growth trees that used to live in Yangon. Before 2008, Yangon used to be a tropical city. There are pictures I have before Nargis that just there are is green as far as the eye can see. And once after Nargis, you suddenly started to be able to see Shredagon from all these different parts of the city that you had never seen it before, because the trees had always obstructed the view. But there were these just massive old growth trees that had been there hundreds of years that were torn out by the roots, and not just by the roots, but even the concrete that was that was around those trees. Massive concrete had been uprooted as well. And so as we went out and started to see this devastation, we just, it completely blew our minds what could be happening in the Delta. And yes, I mean, as you characterized it at the beginning, part nightmare, part dream, part, if I were to talk about it at length, which I'm just giving a briefer here, but it would definitely be part catharsis, part reliving trauma. And it wasn't, when I talk about reliving trauma, it's not so much the trauma I had of nearly dying in my apartment and getting out that I was able to let go of fairly easy. It was more the trauma of the massive suffering in front of us and the hopelessness in trying to deal with it, and living through knowing that the destruction that had been caused in the Delta, and just desperately wanting to get help out there, and living day by day and seeing the roadblocks that were placed, and seeing for the first few days the administration, the military regime did nothing. And the first time they were moved to action was when Burmese in the cities in Yangon started to go themselves and deliver aid, just on their own, because they realized what was happening and how much help was needed. And what did the military do? They set up roadblocks. They arrested, confiscated goods, prevented aid from coming. That was the first action they took, which was just stunning. But then also, as you say, the silver lining that among the work that I was doing, the courses that I was training, we were already, the courses that I was leading, we were already giving them these tools and trainings of how to work together, how to work with people from diverse communities, how to be able to share resources and knowledge. And we were just doing this in a general way. And Nargis happened right in the middle of this. And so with my own eyes, I saw what you described in the book of so many of my students and so many of the people at the American Center just had their eyes opened by this, and realizing that they could do more, that they had an interest and an engagement in society that they hadn't necessarily before. They might have had an interest in monastic schools, or in environment, in the environment, or street children, or something very, very specific and narrow. But this really opened their eyes to something wider. And what I saw happen was that a lot of groups, both the ones I was connected with and then wider in Yangon and through other organizations like British Council or whatnot, started to make like temporary connections to be able to figure out how to deliver aid. And those networks never went away. That's what I observed, is that those temporary networks and even temporary organizations or temporary missions of certain Burmese that were engaged, those were just formed just in immediate urgent response to save lives, because it was really a day-by-day issue of what you saw, this prevention trickling in day by day and just wanting to provide access. And then after Nargis, that temporary kind of stayed on, and groups and nonprofits or civil society organizations that were formed in that moment then were like, hey, we have this structure all of a sudden. We know what to do. Why don't we look at the next thing? Why don't we do this? Or connections between individuals and groups that hadn't existed before and had only come together to provide that aid. We're like, okay, well, what do we do next? And so it was really amazing in those following years to see that development of civil society just grow right in front of you, both in terms of an individual consciousness, a kind of can-do attitude. And then in my mind, what was most exciting, the connections and collaboration with others, because as you know, Myanmar is so diverse with its religions and ethnicities and geography and everything else. And to see, at least in my circle at the American Center and beyond, to see people coming from such diverse backgrounds who were then becoming to trust each other and work together and realize, well, this person has a specialty in, I don't know, hygiene or something. And they've done this a lot. And and in my Kachin community or wherever I am, we need to have these kind of seminars. And so, hey, I can bring this person in on this topic to some community where they haven't been, or they could teach me how to do it. And all these networks was what I saw develop from Nargis and then lead towards that. So it really did spark not just a mental initiative and thought process, but also actually doing things in the world. And I think that was so in the chapter that was captured in what you write. And I think that does lead to the history as it started to unfold after that point.
Yeah, you capture it so well, and the story of what was happening in your apartment. I heard so many stories like that, like roofs spinning in the air, and I recall the folks that were in the embassy, the U.S. embassy at the time, that when they were getting around, they would just see soldiers go and just like pick up the fallen wires and just like put them back up on hooks on the telephone poles. I'm like, oh my God,
right.
Electrocution, folks, like be careful. But that sense of desperation, I think, really focused a lot of people and made it apolitical in some ways, which at that time, I think you needed. But yeah, I mean, just watching it from afar, it was just incredible. And seeing the before and after photos, I just
Right.
couldn't believe it. We had Hurricane Katrina just 3 years earlier, or 2.5 years earlier, and that's in a so-called developed country, and then to see that, it's just, these storms aren't getting any better. But I just think it was such a pivotal moment.
Right. Switching our focus now, we've talked a little bit about the American side and from different angles. Looking at the side of the military regime, we know that there were these really important moments from 1988 to 1990, which ultimately led to the suppression of democracy. And although Ne Win officially resigned during this period, the Tatmadaw only became more entrenched in its rule, even though one can say the style of the authority changed. So in looking up till Nargis, up to Saffron actually, and looking at the shape of the Tatmadaw from 1990 to 2007, leading on the cusp of the transition, how would you characterize what the military regime was like during those years?
So I think after 88, when Ne Win stepped down, I mean, he drove the country down the tubes, especially economically. And I think, there was a lot of internal focus of fighting. I mean, it's almost dual-led. You had the internal focus on fighting dozens of insurgencies, whether it's ideological or ethnic based, which, I think there's a lot of focus now on armed ethnic groups fighting, and this is putting the junta on the ropes, but this is nothing new. They have been fighting for decades, and that's how this military was formed, through guerrilla warfare, through a counterinsurgency, counterterrorism, if you want to call it that. This is how the military has trained, and they're good at it. But I think there was always still a strain of intellectualism that was maintained. There was still pride in education and whatnot. And, when the State Law and Order Restoration Council, then SPDC, I mean, they just crushed that, snuffed it out completely, like health and education, really, forced families to rely on their own resources to truly educate and take care of their families. And it was partly because the junta had no more money. No one was really dealing with them economically. There was a suspension of military exchanges with other countries like the UK and the United States. Aid was suspended. Counter-narcotics operations were suspended. And the junta became increasingly more isolated. It wasn't just their own isolation that they were doing. It was now being imposed on them too. So it was kind of like a double whammy. So you had this junta that was incredibly isolated, that needed money to fight its wars. So they're going to have to take it from somewhere. But, they're only dealing with so many partners. And I think it really shaped their mindset. You didn't have anyone that traveled outside of ASEAN anymore. And even within the junta, you only had Thein Sein travel, who I think, having that experience was really important. Whereas Minang Langong, Russia, great. That's so great.
Right.
But it's a military that became more insular, but it was also a military that's, not getting paid a lot and not being supported very well, but still fully indoctrinated with ethnic Burma supremacist sort of view and Buddhist supremacist sort of view, coupled with this strong nationalism that they're the only institution that can keep the country together. That's not to say that the military is a monolith. You're seeing a lot of desertions now. Again, that's not new. That does not suggest the military is on the ropes, but I think, it does suggest that they've always had a trouble with retention, and whether it's through pay or care or whatnot. But it was, once they dismantled Kin Yunt's military intelligence, which was also meant to keep tabs on foreigners, it really became internal. And I think that's where human rights abuses started to kind of skyrocket, where you had more activities in the ethnic areas. And I think that you're seeing that fully play out now too, as well. And
Mm-hmm.
it's a beast. It certainly is that. And I think, the SPDC, the old guard, I don't see any ghosts of them in this. Even during the opening, there was always a question as where's Than Shui? Is he behind all of this? I think,
Mm-hmm.
he's just trying to be quiet so he doesn't end up in jail.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think Uncle Than Shui has much to do with Minna Lang. I'm sure he gets a visit when you're supposed to visit your elders, but I think
Mm-hmm.
that's
Right.
that's about it.
Yeah, right. Now we're tracking the trajectory of the Tatmadaw after 1988. If we switch over and start looking from the Chinese perspective, this is also around the time in the 90s and 2000s leading to the transition that China starts to become more of a world power. I've understood China's role in Myanmar before this, during the Cold War period, where there's been a lot written about the Chinese Civil War, how the KMT troops on the Burma side and the CIA's involvement there, how that destabilized things, and how the American and the West perspective of Burma was so influenced at the time by the domino effect and the fear of communism spreading. But once the transition, so 1988 to 1990 is a really important set of years, not just in Burma, but outside. You have all of Burma changing with the democratic movement and then its unfortunate suppression. But then around the world, you have the fall of the Soviet Union and Berlin Wall and everything else. And so that the prism with which the West looks at Burma changes completely from being one of the Cold War to being human rights. And that's because of internal and external factors. This is still looking at it from this perspective of the West and even a perspective within Myanmar of what's happening there. But if we're going from a Chinese perspective, looking at 1990 on to those transition years, how would you characterize that? Of course, there's the BRI that is fueling a lot of Chinese investment, and there's so much more Chinese involvement and Chinese hands in Myanmar and in Myanmar leadership and the economy and such that is going on during those transition years. From the start of looking at from the start of 1990 and then through what you cover in the book, how would you characterize things from the Chinese perspective and what they're doing and why they're doing it?
Yeah, I think one word that summarizes their relationship, if you could do it, is complicated.
Right.
And I think there's always this simplistic idea that, Myanmar is practically a proxy state for China.
Right.
They're going to get whatever they want. And I'm like, have you met the Myanmar people? I mean, I think
it's
this
not
is
true.
where, yeah. And I think that this is where, if there's any commonality at all, is that Myanmar is very proud. Definitely gets concerned about its sovereignty and internal affairs and, the whole stooges business. But I think that's a sentiment that runs through the blood of everyone there. You don't want to be a puppet for anybody. So China may have very different views about that. But I mean, the role of China and the relationship between China and Myanmar is incredibly interesting. And there's so many things at play because you have the Central Communist Party of China and their relationship coming out of Beijing. But then you also have the relationship between Yunnan and the armed ethnic groups on the eastern side. I mean, they share a very long border. They're a neighbor. You have to deal with them at any time. There's a lot of familial and cultural ties, but there's also trade and business ties that go back to, before the United States was even a country. So, to try to turn that off. But as Myanmar is consistently told and also believe, as they should, it's a very strategically located place. You're between India and China. You could be the crossroads between South, Northeast, Southeast Asia. You're right there. You have, airports, ports. China's BRI project, especially its oil and gas pipeline and the port in Chapu in Rakhine State, allows them access to Bengal, the Bay of Bengal, which gives them access to India's backyard, but also to a massive increase in trade activity, but not just trade, but potentially military engagements as well. That said, again, I think it's very clear on the Myanmar military side that no foreign military can dock there. So, China may be able to do a fuel stop there, but I think that's all they'll be allowed. But, a lot of it has been based on economics, but also diplomatic protection. In 1988, talk about just a pivotal year globally. You're talking about the fall of communism and just the utility of Myanmar. Myanmar is, I think, very well known for bad timing, but the utility of putting up with Myanmar in the fight against communism is now gone. And if you look at the archives and, the engagement between the Ne Win government and successive U.S. administrations, a lot of it was based on counter-narcotics cooperation, which directly impacted the United States, but also in the fight against communism, because Ne Win was no fan of communists, as one of the largest insurgents was communists, supported by China.
Yep.
And never mind the KMT up in Kachin State. So you have that as well. But that utility disappeared overnight. And now you can really take a human rights example or human rights focused on the atrocities that they're pulling from 88 to 1990. So after that, again, there's no love lost between China and Myanmar. So, that period between 1990 and 2000, I think, it's still China's still not what it was or what it is now. It had solidified its gains. The Communist Party of Burma collapsed, created ceasefires with the government, and then basically just worked on its own businesses, which was primarily narcotics, which again is not great for China either. But this is where that Beijing Yunnan division kind of comes into play, where you have these armed ethnic groups. They're still well armed. You have the Naiwa State Army, various Kokang armies, other Shan-based armies, and they're doing their narcotics business, but they're also trafficking in a lot of other things like wildlife, people, other sorts of materials, which can be useful. They also can have casinos, which are illegal in China. So there's a lot of gambling towns on that border. It's really just like the wild, wild west times gazillions. And so, not necessarily something that Beijing looks on. But then there's also questionable ties between PLA and these armed ethnic groups when it comes to training. When you look at some of these military parades on YouTube or training videos, there are PLA soldiers there. Are they sanctioned by Beijing? Probably not. Almost certainly not. By Yunnan? Almost certainly not. These are really kind of like direct people-to-people ties, I think. So that is and will continue to be a source of tension. And even I think Beijing has acknowledged they don't fully have a good understanding of what's going on in Yunnan and that, but it's not certainly something that they officially sanction. After 2000, I think you saw a lot more diplomatic protection. The UN started sending envoys, writing a lot of angry pieces of, it's not legislation, but I'm totally blanking on the word for what it is, but in the UN General Assembly, trying to shield them from sanctions because of their seat on the UN Security Council, so they can protect, like North Korea, Myanmar from more harmful actions by the international community. And they're always a backdrop. This is where sanctions has a weakness. If you can find an alternative, they're not as effective. So yes, you can have the West blockade, but if you have China, you can kind of, get by. It's not great since you're going to be almost solely reliant on them, but it's not the worst thing either, especially if it's your neighbor. But as China has strengthened economically, militarily, it's that much more important, I think, for Myanmar, but still is complicated because Myanmar never wants to be a proxy state for China. There were a lot of causes for concern. The U.S. Institute for Peace has done some excellent pieces on this, but these somewhat digital annexations of part of Shan State, where there's these companies going in to set up like so-called smart cities, but it's offering e-citizenship and its own cryptocurrency, and is completely outside the legal and governing structure of the country. The NLD was concerned about it. I'm sure Min Aung Hlaing isn't super jazzed about it either. And Beijing said that they had no knowledge of what was going on. So there's those things that are starting to happen. Your classic BRI projects, whether it's the Chakpu port and whatnot, those will continue. I'm sure you're going to see the Myitsone Dam restart if it hasn't already. Haven't been following it that closely, so feel free to correct me on that. But they need these projects, and if not for a point of pride, then to just get them done. And I think, there's a cause for alarm along the major rivers in Myanmar that, these mega projects only benefit one country, really, and the coffers of just a handful of people. So it's still fairly exploitive. I think in Myanmar, China can get away with a lot more because the people don't have a say. But if I were China, I'd be looking at Sri Lanka right now as an example of, maybe not. And we'll just see how long this lasts. No one's exactly thrilled with the sack, but it's complicated. I mean, China, I think, wants to be on the global stage without any of the responsibilities of these on their side. And, they have their own concerns they have to deal with COVID and, these banks failing and their own economy. But so Myanmar can sometimes be a distraction, but it's still an important relationship. I don't see it going anywhere anytime soon. But it's as long as China is there, it really weakens, I think, any harsh sanctions or prohibiting weapons sales, because they do have that alternative, as well as Russia and Belarus, other great friends in the United States.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that. And just jumping around some more, I realize, although we're talking 2 hours, and 2 hours seems like a lot of time, you have such a wealth of knowledge. And Myanmar, as you mentioned, just in the relationship with China, is so complicated that we're just able to do these little surveys on these areas, jumping around, topical, sequentially, and then hopefully by the end start to look at where all of these come together, where these understandings of these different perspectives, different people, different motivations, how they tell us where we got to now. So jumping to the next topic, the person, Aung San Suu Kyi. So you had a line in the book that I thought was really profound about her. I've thought this as well myself, but I've never heard it quite expressed so succinctly. So I wanted to read this quote. You wrote, quote, "Maybe none of us knew her at all, or only heard what we wanted to hear from a caged bird. We were too busy telling the story of a woman who couldn't speak for herself for 25 years. Once she could, we didn't like what we heard," end quote. I thought this was a really powerful summary of the outsized role that she's played when we're looking at the one's perspective or prism of Myanmar, and perhaps some of the misunderstanding around it. I think it also leads to the crux of the question, which is probably impossible to answer conclusively, but I'll ask you anyway. Not that you have magical powers to know things that no one else does. Just putting it out there. This is right. This is something that many people are wondering. There's many different takes on it, so we're getting your take, not the authoritative one, because that history is still unfolding. But in other words, that question is: what are her real values and objectives? How does she see the world? How does she see Myanmar? What does she want? What is she prioritizing? Who is she, basically? Because I think this quote gets at her silence allowed, and it was really, one has to say, it really was a noble silence. And as I say that, it's funny because the word noble silence, for those that are in meditation, noble silence refers to silent retreats where you're not just silent by mouth, but you're also silent by gesture and communication with others. It's a noble silence that you're really living within for those yogis on a meditation retreat. But there is a sense of 25 years of noble silence on the part of Aung San Suu Kyi, where she's, we see this person of dignity making this enormous sacrifice on so many levels. And because she can't speak for herself, because she can't act for herself, because we only have this past segmented history to draw upon, and her father being as significant as he was. And at that time, I think maybe the more nuanced or complicated history of Aung San wasn't really as talked about as it is now. So it's and the ethnic views of what the Bamar national movement was at that time, all of these conform to a a lack of a nuanced view of seeing this person making this sacrifice and imbuing in her what we want of her. This is also going back to your opening quote of the book, where it's the observer is actually changing the nature of the experiment through simply observing and watching Aung San Suu Kyi's noble silence and her house arrest. As an observer, we are putting values and assumptions into who we think she is. But then when she actually comes to talk and act and take charge, somewhat of a different person emerges. So getting back to just building up this this question and giving some context, who do you see? Who is she really? What is she about? What is she aiming for? As far as you can use your CIA analyst skills to being able to draw a picture for us.
I think the most simple way to put it is she's a human being. And that comes with the flaws and the benefits and whatnot. And, it's not her fault she was made into myth. I mean, the Greeks taught the West about what tragedy is, but they certainly didn't have the monopoly on tragic stories. And I think Aung San Suu Kyi is a really tragic story. She lost everything, has once again lost everything. But, I think the things that make someone survive house arrest. Now, I think we all got a taste of that in like the nicest of ways during COVID, right? Stuck in your place. You get the COVID-19, you kind of lose your mind. So imagine being in that for 10 years at a time, a couple of years at a time, without Zoom, without internet, without cable, without power sometimes, very little connection to the outside world, and to be able to survive that intact mentally and physically. That is, I think, I am like a shadow of my former pre-COVID self, I have to say, and I had all I had to do was stay home. I didn't get sick. I was very lucky. But she was incredibly disciplined and kept focusing on what the ultimate goal was. And I think we kind of missed some of the messaging. I was speaking with Tatmadaw, who's historian, who's written several books himself, his grandfather. And I know your I almost said viewers, listeners are well aware. His grandfather was the Secretary General of the UN. Right. And he was noting that if you read a lot of her earlier works, including in Freedom from Fear or any of her earlier scholarly writings, they were very nationalistic.
Right.
And she's Buddhist and she's Burma. And, she learned a lot about Burma from, very elite individuals. Like, that's not to take anything away from who she is. But do you think that, Warren Buffett can really talk about what the average American is going through now? And it's somewhat similar, but she also is imbued with this sense and responsibility of history, and that her father, who's also become a myth, started the Burma Army, basically helped gain the country's independence from the British, and is just this overwhelming force. And with this junta, his former comrades are trying to, disappear his memory. And then, 1988 happens. She just so happens to be in the country tending to her ailing mother, and hears the call of history and answers it. And in the process, loses her family again. Her mother passes away, more than 10 years later, her husband passes away. She never sees her children, grandchildren she's never met. I mean, how awful. And you don't know what that does to a person. And frankly, I don't think anyone cared. Like, who was offering her mental health assistance or anything? And like, I think everyone's like, oh, the struggle. And those, I think that were so enamored and supported with her. I mean, they talked about her like she was an otherworldly being.
Yeah.
And, she's magical and she is charismatic. But I think, she also had the benefit of being a good-looking woman, very well educated, had beautiful English, and she dressed the part. And like, again, that that wasn't her like tricking us. That's who she
Mm-hmm.
is. And it just
Right.
fit. And then I think for everybody else, when she couldn't speak for herself, oh, it's very perfect. We can speak for her. And, this is all trying to get to me like delaying answering your question because, she's a very, I think she's just a person. She's a human being who
Mm-hmm.
has biases, who doesn't fully understand how ethnic minorities were treated. Nobody did. And in fact, even in Mandalay and Yangon, and they're only now getting a taste of it as the junta strafes their streets, tanks in, and the most interesting thing I heard was, and I think I included this in the book, but one of the 88 generation students who I hung out with quite a lot, but he was saying the best national reconciliation was when they were in prison with all the military intelligence folks.
Right.
And that they were able to kind of talk through like what were each side fighting for? Like what did they really represent? But then they could also see the difference in treatment with Burma and Buddhists and Muslims and ethnic minorities.
Mm-hmm.
You get 10 Burma to a cell, you got 100 Karen in another.
Mm-hmm.
You could get beaten bloody and to near death. You may not walk out of a torture room if you're Sean. And I think it's very easy from your own perspective to see how bad you have it. And you do have it bad, but then you see how badly it is. And I don't think Aung San Suu Kyi really ever experienced that. Yeah. And I think she had her own biases as well about Muslims. I think she bought a line on that. And she was hearing it from her own close advisors as well, not just the military. But I think what we'll never get a full story on, ever, unfortunately, is how she was trying to negotiate with the military to buy time to keep the democracy experiment going, and what she felt she had to sacrifice. Like her trip to The Hague, which, let me tell you, politically, domestically, was a big one for her. Not with the military, but with everybody else.
Right.
I don't think we'll ever truly know. I know she had a plan. Whether or not that plan was going to work. But I think once the international community turned on her for the Rohingya issue, the military realized she wasn't useful to them anymore, and it really didn't matter. And that's, I think, what also makes me feel sad, because like what she did about the Rohingya, the silence over Koni's assassination, that hurts. It's very sad. And I'm like, I think if you said something, at least the mobs wouldn't have attacked. The military, that's another thing.
Yeah.
But at least the actual people may have stopped and thought. But we'll never know. I wish she could have said something. She's the only person who had the power to do that. But for the swift reaction, like no one wanted to talk to her, and to be fair, she didn't want to listen either, because again, it went from we must listen to Aung San Suu Kyi and all the magical things she said while she was under house arrest to like, bitch, you don't know nothing, and like we're going to tell you what we need you to do. And you know what? Like, let me tell you, getting mansplained, it's not fun. And she was getting that from everybody all of the time. And to go from being like built up to this mythic god to them being criticized all the time like that and told what to do. Yeah, she's going to be a little ornery for sure and not listen to you, which, again, like that wasn't the way to do it. But we created a monster too. And that's on us. Yeah. So I don't know. She's I wouldn't even say she's a complicated figure, because we all are. We all have feelings and biases and very strong opinions about things, but she has had to deal with things that none of us could even comprehend. So I am obviously compartmentalize some things, but at this stage, I just feel very sorry for her.
That's a great answer. I really appreciate that nuance and that complexity. And I think this also goes into what we were talking about before this interview, is just how Burma is usually defined by a lack of nuance, by black and white issues of, first it was the Cold War and the domino effect, and then narcotics and the war on drugs played a role, and then it was human rights and Aung San Suu Kyi, and the whole country was understood by Western observers mainly just through these big block lens of how, what do we know about Aung San Suu Kyi and what is she saying, or whatever the lens happened to be of the moment. There are a couple other of these lenses to continue looking through that just that defined American policy and American perspective of trying to understand the country, as well as told the story of how the relations and the engagement and the transition were going. So another one of these big block perspectives to look at is that of sanctions. And this is something that you devote a whole chapter to. And the development of sanctions in 1988 through the transition period and the debate and discussion around which sanctions and how to begin to let go of and to release. This is a really complicated and detailed subject, and we don't have the time to be able to go into the depth that you do in your writing. So I really encourage listeners to go and read that book, and you do a really excellent job of detailing the arguments for and against sanctions at different periods. And what was interesting to me is not just the arguments of for and against sanctions in terms of policy, but also how the emotion was driving some of those decisions. So what can you tell us about sanctions when they came on the scene in 88 and then their complicated trajectory through the transition period?
Yeah, you hit on a key word here, which is emotional. And I think that that's what's really driven this policy. Is there some strategic angles to it? Sure. But and everyone talks about, well, China this and China that. But if the United States cared so much about China and taking away all its friends, like we'd never have sanctions in the first place, or they would have been lifted a lot sooner. But, the first round of punitive actions was mostly to stop like almost any male contact. And that included any exchanges of training, whether it's IMET, which is mostly like English language, or they come over here and embed in the military, and foreign military sales. So that was all cut. Counter narcotics as well, which, you send them the dusters, I guess, like the little planes that dust the opium plants. And so that was taken. Of course, you could also outfit that to like shoot people, but, so that was gone. But the real economic sanctions started happening around 1997 when President Clinton imposed the investment ban, and then only grew. And it was mostly around Aung San Suu Kyi. So she gets released, I think it was in 1996. Hijinks ensue. We imposed the investment ban with a lot of support from her. She helped drive a lot of the sanctions discussion, as well as aid and assistance. Our aid dropped to nothing almost. And it's easy to talk about poverty and emerging economies. And, I think we also have very biased views on where that happens. Myanmar is poor, very poor. There are places that have no access to any sense of electricity at all, that they're, reading by candlelight or, fire and whatnot. I mean, most rudimentary of things. So aid and assistance was half of what we were giving Laos, which was not a whole hell of a lot, and to Bangladesh, which also like there were some restrictions there as well around labor and other issues. So in 2003, it also starts ramping up. Congress also played a big role in this Burma Freedom and Democracy Act, which put in an import ban, and the 2008 Tom Lantos JADE Act, Junta Anti-Democratic Efforts Act. Everybody loves a good acronym. Senate is very, or Congress is very skilled at these sorts of things, which also put a ban on the import of jade and rubies. It was efforts. Some of them are symbolic, like, you don't see a lot of jade around here, but anything that the junta made money on, how could we start targeting these? In 2003, you also started seeing a difference in how the U.S. Treasury issued sanctions or implemented sanctions overall. Previously, you would have like these big bans, things that were just kind of blunt, Cuba, I think, is a great example of what we did in early Iran sanctions. But the idea here was to get targeted because there was a growing concern that you were going to start harming the average person, which does two things: hurts the people we don't want to, and two, gives an argument to whatever government is in charge, saying, oh my goodness, it's the United States that is doing this to you. We're trying to protect you, and everything that we do, they sanction us even further. I think that's what Russia is trying to do now. Other countries have done this in the past. So the idea of doing targeted sanctions through adding names to the so-called it is called the specially designated and blocked nationals list, which is primarily U.S. based. And what I mean by that is that it prohibits dollar-denominated transactions. It prohibits U.S. companies or individuals from the U.S. in dealing with any sanctioned individual or entity on that list. But where it does make things tricky for other countries is that banks often deal in U.S. dollar transactions. Almost every company has some sort of U.S. subsidiary or component. So it gets pretty messy pretty quickly. So the easiest thing to do, rather than get fined or sanctioned yourself, is to just not deal with it at all. And the U.S. started imposing this, creating, I think the BFDA and other executive orders outline criteria how to add to the sanctions list. So it was anyone providing material support to the junta. That meant that that can mean anything, really. Like, you build a hotel in Naypyidaw at their orders, you give money to a fund, et cetera, et cetera. So that's how they targeted the so-called cronies, Teza, Zaza, Stephen Lawn, and quite a few others. And also targeting big entities, big companies, state-owned enterprises. There's several types of sanctions targeting Myanmar, or that Myanmar gets caught up in. Both the Drug Kingpin Act, so a lot of the WA are pretty well sanctioned on that, and then all the DPRK sanctions, so any military sales to and from that country, and Myanmar keeps violating those, and UN Security Council resolutions on that. So they're a mess. But then there became more of a misunderstanding of what sanctions can and cannot do. Now, what was great was the Europeans were all on board with this as well, and Japan to some extent followed along with it. So it really limited a lot of economic engagement in the country, and we're able to have kind of a united stand. But around 2011, when the country opened, there was sort of less and less argument to keep it on. And so the Europeans were like, let's just get rid of this. Not to say that there wasn't a debate there, but we knew, the United States, that if the Europeans took away their sanctions, ours would be so much less effective. Because not only would the Thein Sein government have new opportunities, they'd have a ton of alternatives to the United States, not just China. I mean, they could finally diversify away from China, from Russia, from DPRK, not so much on military sales. Israel took up that mantle quite a bit, but they could have French and German, engineering companies, new products, all sorts of things come in there. And that's kind of exactly what happened. So we lost a ton of leverage when the Europeans lifted sanctions in 2012. And the United States was essentially the only ones left. We had an SDN list. It made things complicated, but not impossible for foreign companies to go in. But American companies just wouldn't even take the chance because, sanctioned cronies owned hotels. What happens if they stayed in them? Trying to rent any homes or office space, you didn't know if you were going to run into a crony, and what if you did? Where else were you going to go? There was such limited space. If you go to a shopping mall, who owns it? You buy a car, who'd you get it from? It was just so complicated that it really, I think, the sanctions easing on the European side really went to the detriment of the United States. But then with everything changing, there's more and more of a question of why do we still have this on? And now I think I'm answering other questions that you didn't ask.
No, go ahead.
But so in 2012, the U.S. also talked about easing sanction. One, it lifted the investment ban. So companies that were already there could expand their operations, and new companies could go in. They weren't prevented from doing so. And then the ban on the exportation of financial services, which was also really important. That meant that they could move money, that they could actually operate in a country, except the problem was all of the banks in Myanmar were on the SDN list. So they basically, gave you a car without wheels. So the next year, the U.S. had to issue a general license to allow at least 4 banks to work with Americans, which this is where things start getting tricky, and where the sense of sanctions and optics get really confused, is that it was being seen as giving too much too soon, and that everything was seen as a give, not as a technical fix. That general license in 2013 to work with those banks, that was a technical fix. A couple of years later, a general license to work on, to be able to, open the port in Yangon that was owned by Asia World, which was Stephen Law's company, and the military. That was a technical fix. That wasn't a give to Stephen Law. It was so that we didn't inadvertently cause a Cuba-like embargo, because the port decided to change paperwork, and then all of a sudden everyone realized that most of the port traffic, onloading and offloading, was going through the Asia World port terminal. Those were technical fixes, not gives. And then there was a sense of like, okay, well, if we put someone on the SDN list, or if we take someone off the SDN list, we have to put someone on. It's not how it works. The idea is that you want to get a sanctions list down to 0 because your policy is working. You're not trying to keep finding bad actors. Like, yes, of course, if there are people doing bad things, go after them. But you can't, but if there are none, then there are none. So that just made the sanctions easing process that much harder. And of course, there were a lot of people, and I'm sure some of the listeners today, that thought that, the U.S. went too far in easing sanctions. But, 1, what choice had we? 2, the way that the sanctions were written were for a different time. It was talking about putting the NLD in power, check, to, get, X, Y, and Z, like human rights abuses. They had done quite a few steps that addressed that. And dealing with the North Koreans, they were starting to take steps to address that as well. So we needed a different policy for a different time if you want to keep sanctions on. But in the country, Aung San Suu Kyi had changed her mind, even though there's a lot of debate about whether or not that she did, that it was time for the NLD to make their own foreign policy decisions, and they didn't want sanctions to be an obstacle. They didn't want to run into something where, hey, we'd like to do this, and then find out that somehow U.S. sanctions block that action from happening, and it would take 6 months to fix it. So in some ways, it was just much easier to take everything off and deal with the problems as they came. Again, it is much easier to put on sanctions, as we've seen in the Russian case. Libya, too, if everyone can go back that far, and North Korea, than it is to take them off. And I think that was the choice that they made then. Now, of course, we're seeing them all come back on, and for good reason. But I think there's a question of efficacy, and there always will be that debate, that we didn't squeeze hard enough, so we didn't really see how effective they could be. But if you don't think we squeezed hard enough on Myanmar to make a change, I just point you to the example of Cuba. What have we done there? Nothing.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I think as I was reading your book, one of the things that stood out to me and made the focus a bit clearer in reading these different arguments, both in terms of strategy and emotion of for and against the sanctions at different times, was that when the transition started in earnest, there was this feeling in the government of like, what is going to be the more effective strategy to pursue? Is it going to be more effective to keep up hard sanctions and really try to regulate this behavior until we get exactly what we want? Or is it better? It's certainly more riskier. It's obviously higher risk, higher reward, but to take the sanctions off almost completely and just let the free market and access to the wider world start to bring in things and teach the country things that we can't through our strict regulations. So in other words, which of these strategies is going to have the better long-term effect through our own tightening control, or just letting the reins off and just hoping that this thing can stay afloat on its own without our strict monitoring of it, and that eventually that seems like the argument that won out in the transition period.
Yeah, because it also came down to a question of leverage. How much leverage could we have for sanctions? I don't think anyone fully trusted the government not to start backsliding. I mean, there were troubling things around on the Rohingya, even before the NLD, both with the Thein Sein government and with the NLD, of course. These race and religion laws, their flirtation with Buddhist nationalists like Uwi Rathu.
Yeah.
Can't speak at all. So, and also ongoing concerns around the peace process and how, Thein Sein would say one thing, like, for example, he ordered a ceasefire on Christmas Eve in 2011 against the Kachin Independence Army, and the military was like, that's nice, and just basically still, continued with the conflict. And there was, a lot of concerns about the military's trustworthiness. So could sanctions have been the leverage that we needed there? And I think that's where the debate really centered on. And it's hard to have leverage when you're the only one trying to push for it and everybody else is going in. So again, this is not if all our friends jump off the cliff, so will we. Because obviously there's, again, we've talked about this as an emotional issue and one that was formulated through a human rights lens, but that there's also a moral ground that you can stand on. But are you being morally sound if you're withdrawing any economic development from the people of Burma? And it wasn't an easy debate at all. And so, but the thing is that you couldn't keep moving the goalposts either, saying, oh, wait, now there's a new issue, keep the sanctions on. Mm-hmm. And so I think that goes, to an argument I was making earlier, in that then you need a new policy for new issues and one that makes sense. And again, since this country wasn't super linked to the international financial system, sanctions aren't going to have the impact that you want it to. And I think there's a lot of magical thinking around sanctions, and also the ability for countries to just suck it up and go through it, because, the junta can get by, but can the people, and who are they going to blame for it? So, I think sanctions can accomplish some things. At least, it was helpful in the opening to show this is the realm of possibility as we ease, or if we ease. I think the U.S. did it correctly at the beginning of, easing it a bit at a time and not fully. But I think that at some point it should have been fully lifted a little bit earlier than it had, because I think, our companies were at a real disadvantage, but also our ability to influence as well. So there's all those calculations that you have to make with sanctions. And again, I think there's a big narrative that we just didn't try hard enough with the sanctions. And, you have to look at the tools that you have and what sanctions are meant to do.
Right. So sanctions, the easing of sanctions in transition leads directly into investment. And you have a great quote to start your chapter on investment, or maybe not to start, but in that chapter, talking to, I think it was a Japanese worker or businessman, saying that if you don't have water or electricity, you can do great business in Myanmar, which definitely is true in my experience at that time. You characterize that period, which I was living through, and anyone else who would be familiar to, is this kind of fever pitch excitement of people who are wanting to invest in Myanmar as kind of a last final frontier market that is now opening, and yet the challenges they run into. I remember as I was living through that time, hearing stories of billionaires landing in their own planes in Yangon to look for investment opportunities, and leaving that evening just after a day of feeling like this is hopeless. And you described the 4 L's, which I hadn't heard before. Can you describe what the 4 L's mean and how this characterizes the challenges of the investment period?
Yeah, hopefully I can remember the 4 L's, but it's along the lines of listen, look, learn, leave. And sometimes I called it the 5 L's: listen, learn, look, leave, and laugh. Right. Because, again, I think with the isolation of the country, both self-imposed and imposed by others, and the sanctions, no one went there. They had no idea what it looked like. Very few did. I mean, ASEAN countries knew what they were getting into because they were already there. Japan, to some extent, did as well. But Western companies had no clue. And they were like, oh, this is going to be so exciting. This is like a virgin market. We're going to go and do everything. And it was a shock to the system because, never mind, rule of law in a business friendly environment, but just the physical infrastructure. I mean, electricity, internet connectivity. At that point when it first opened, it was thousands of dollars to connect to like dial-up internet and cell phones, like never mind. So you just have to show up at a meeting and hope that someone was there. And I think for anyone flying over there, and especially from the US, you're just kind of used to like always be closing, be done with a deal by the end of the day, or at least, have some deliverables by the end of it. And because you're going all that way, you just don't have the time. But Myanmar operates on a completely different time. But I would say the region does as well, that, it's TT lunch. You meet and get to know folks before you start talking business. And that just didn't happen. That and trying to get meetings in Naypyidaw. I mean, who do you contact? It was better than it was in 2006 when the junta just upped and left for Naypyidaw, and there was only a fax number that you could reach them.
Yeah.
Like, where were those faxes even going? But this, again, who do you call? Who's going to pick up the phone? How do you schedule? And then when you did get on the schedule, sometimes you'd show up in Naypyidaw and be like, oh, we can't meet today. How about next week? And it's like, I'm not here. Going back to America. Like, that's not how this works. But also just like how ramshackle everything was. And I think that muscle memory for working frontier markets is gone in a lot of developed countries. And it was risky, like never mind, potential sanctions implications. It was just a tough market. And I think there was a lot of miscommunication and mismanaged expectations on both sides and all sides, in fact, where, Myanmar were expecting like skyscrapers and jobs and everything to just show up very quickly, not recognizing that the system they had was not investment ready. There was no understanding of why that was the case, because they had been hearing for their entire lives about, Myanmar has everything, and I say that story to all the resources, location, labor, whatnot, but they're not trained. The government doesn't have the capacity to implement and enforce like important laws. And again, they don't have the infrastructure for it. On the investor side, it was, they had no idea as to how underdeveloped the country was. And I think just were not prepared. They remembered, the country of the 60s that was, a hub for KLM and Pan Am and, best medical care. And I'm like, oh, a lot has changed. So, and then, it was just totally mismanaged.
So there's this really interesting period where you have all these things in the process of evolving, and in some cases not really following a very straight trajectory, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, or maybe 1 step forward, 2 steps back. In terms of politics, in terms of the ethnic Bamar relations, in terms of the sanctions and the investment that's happening, the elections that are taking place, the role of Aung San Suu Kyi, the role of China, all of these things are coming together. And as we talked before the interview, we referenced just how incredible it was that so much was happening in such a short period of time. It feels like this was actually much longer. But then as all of this kind of messy soup of possibility and disappointment and potential and all these things are happening, what happens in the middle of that but the Rohingya? And we certainly don't have the time to go through the history of the Rohingya crisis, and that's also not your angle. There's authors who've spent much time in telling that story. But what's important about the Rohingya for the story we're telling is that it seems to derail everything that's going on. And it, as we talk about Myanmar being a place which has extraordinary diversity and nuance and color, and yet, ironically, it's seen more one-dimensionally and through one lens than any other place. just as before it was seen through the lens of communism or of Aung San Suu Kyi or of human rights or whatever. Now Myanmar is only seen through the lens of the Rohingya crisis. And this becomes what I guess I might call an irreconcilable difference, that you have people looking at it from outside the country that cannot see anything beyond the Rohingya crisis, which is still true today. I mean, there are terrible responses that you read online of how the Myanmar people deserve what's happening with the coup because of the Rohingya crisis, because they can only see through this prism. And yet this is not in any way to discount the seriousness of the problem, and that it should be looked at. And I mean, it's been classified as a genocide. This should be taken with that level of gravity. And yet at the same time, this is not the only thing happening. There are many other things that are happening concurrently, but you have this kind of perfect storm where the West is now really unable, the rest of the world is really unable to see beyond any engagement or anything in Myanmar beyond this Rohingya crisis, while at the same time, the Bamar in Myanmar, for the most part, are not even wanting to take it even to the smallest degree of consideration or of discussion. They simply don't understand at any level why people are even talking about this. So what can you say about, as in this story that we're telling, and this year by year study that you've made in the book and that we're having in this conversation, suddenly the Rohingya crisis lights up. And then what does that do to the development process and the conversation and relations around Myanmar?
It sucked the life out of everything. You're right. I mean, it was the only prism that anyone was looking at Myanmar to. I mean, was it awful? Yes, of course. And this is not to diminish anything about how bad the Rohingya issue was, but again, also not new. The pace of the refugees going to Bangladesh, I mean, that was the fastest movement up until Ukraine of people moving since World War II. But the issue against the Rohingya has been going on through this since the 70s. And to say that, I know Politico did a piece, the genocide the U.S. didn't see coming. That's not true. We knew and had always known that this was an issue. You had people who were desk officers in the 90s trying to reach out to the IOC countries, Islamic organization countries, to try to do something on this. Could they take refugees? Is there any interest in supporting any resolutions in the UN? No interest whatsoever. It is primarily a Myanmar issue, but it is that they somehow attract regional disgust. No one wanted them in the Middle East. No one wanted them in Southeast Asia, and that includes in Indonesia and Malaysia. And it was a great domestic political point. But it had gotten so bad that, there have been sparks of violence over the years, 2009, 2012, 2014, 2017, and 2018. And, these purges would happen, but, obviously you can't ignore them, especially in the last one. I think, again, just to bemoan Myanmar's awful timing is that,
right.
I think if we can recall and at least give her some credit, I mean, I'm not going to be Aung San Suu Kyi's great defender because I think she fell flat on this and deserved the criticism that she got. But I think, again, Myanmar deserves more nuance than what it received. And recognizing that, as you said, there are a lot of issues going on, and sometimes they do not relate. And you don't compartmentalize them, but you deal with them in different ways. And, Mitch McConnell understood this when, I think it was Senators McCain and Cardin tried to push through certain Burma acts around this. And then even after McCain's death, McConnell refused to put it on the calendar for a vote because he's like, they don't understand what kind of pressure she's under and that she needs as much leverage with the military as possible to make sure that she can continue to stay in power because she was elected, noted. And I agree with him on that. Rohingya, I mean, Kofi Annan, does his commission. Aung San Suu Kyi told him to be as upfront as possible. And then he delivers a report a year later. So, the commission starts in 2017 after some violence, and then is delivered in 2018. And the ARSA attacks happened the next day. I mean, my God, was it planned? I don't know, but it was just so terrible. And the military reacted, and it was a massacre. So what can you do then? And say, let's go back to the Kofi Annan Commission report. And then, Aung San Suu Kyi doesn't say anything. So how do we go from the 2017 Aung San Suu Kyi to 2018 Aung San Suu Kyi? And I think that there's an important question there of which I have zero answers. But then this back home in the United States starts a conversation of, we lifted sanctions too soon. If we had kept them in place, this would have never happened, which I think is the most ridiculous argument ever, because there was an argument on keeping sanctions on the two military holding companies, Mech and Mao, that had its fingers in some lucrative enterprises, including like ruby and jade sales. But those ruby and jade sales didn't happen in the United States. They went to markets in Hong Kong, Thailand, and China. Our sanctions can't touch that. And I think the sanctions that are already in place are not going to spook a military that, again, doesn't have like a Visa or a MasterCard and looks to go shopping in overseas. They see terrorists. They see Muslims who they don't like. They got permission from a Buddhist monk, where some did not like the idea of mowing down innocent, unarmed people. But, the military calls in a monk to tell them, cite some really ridiculous unknown 8th century sutra saying that anybody who's not Buddhist is not, human or subhuman, which I don't know. That doesn't sound very Buddhist to me. But I don't see how sanctions could have prevented that. And frankly, no one was interested in the issue globally until they were. And everybody failed. The Rohingya. I mean, I'm not saying the U.S. tried and was denied, but it was also the victim of bad timing. I mean, some of the bigger ideas. I mean, it takes big thinking and funding and policy and constant gardening on these issues to make sure that there's some effect. I mean, no one's been good at preventing a genocide. There's been, case studies that seem why, but to fix the problem so it doesn't happen again takes a ton of resources. Well, we have political cycles and politicals going in and out. You have tight budgets. It's very hard to get people enthusiastic for putting in a lot of time into what is depressing and a hard thing to do. I see that everywhere, though. Everything's a hard problem. Look how well we dealt with COVID, inflation, all of these things. It's very easy to make it as black and white as possible because the hard work is super hard. And it's not rewarding every day. You may not see the rewards in your lifetime. And that's very tough to deal with. But the thing is, though, Myanmar doesn't have to come up with a solution from scratch. I mean, this is the unfortunate thing. We've seen genocide in many, many a place. Perhaps the Balkans is a better example for them to go forward. But, any sort of national reconciliation, I think, at least with this national unity government and also with people who have experienced the brutality of the military that never had before, have a lot more sympathy for the Rohingya. So I think there is an understanding that they are part of the national reconciliation discussion. But, sanctions got reimposed very quickly after the Rohingya crisis. Again, would it have prevented anything? Very doubtful.
Right. So this brings us up closer to the present day, looking at the launch of the military coup in February 2021. And a two-part question with that. So the first part is just looking at the decade of transition or so that you cover in the book, the different angles and topics that you looked at, wondering how the confluence of what you studied might have led to the coup being launched. And I like the Aung San Suu Kyi question, the question of what is really in Min Aung Hlaing's mind. Why did he do what he did? This is also an unanswerable question, certainly now when there's so little facts in front of us. But just the first part of the question is looking at in studying these factors that you looked at and then seeing how the coup was launched, where do you see some of these factors playing a role in the coup taking place? And the second part of the question is, and this is something I've asked other people who have been looking at the reasons behind the coup and the coup taking place, is there anything that could have happened that might have prevented the coup? Interestingly, the Burmese people that I asked this to feel resoundingly no. And in some way, the quote that really stands out in my mind is a Burmese economist who studied at Oxford. And when I asked him this over a year ago, and still word for word, this answer still rings in my mind, is so powerful. He said, first of all, he said, no, I don't think anything could have been done. And then he added, I feel really shitty to say this, but I have to admit that part of me is actually glad that the coup happened because it exposed these really deep institutional problems in our country that, and he's a Bamar Buddhist, but he said that among other Bamar Buddhists, and certainly the ethnics who know about this more, know about these rotten things that are existing that are just going to keep persisting and that society itself is not really looking at and even brainwashed to. And so he felt that there was nothing that could have stopped the coup, nothing that that could have been done, and that he actually had a bit of a sick relief that it happened just to be able to expose and hopefully root these things out. And that to me, that was very telling. Someone that was on the inside of this and studying this had those kinds of feelings with it. With as far as your analysis goes and looking at the factors that you were studying, how did those factors lead in your mind? And I understand this might be a premature question, so just more roughly off the top of your head, if you hadn't had the time to really study it and have the material available, how did these factors you looked at in the book lead to the coup taking place? And is there anything that, if it had turned out differently, this might not have happened?
Sure. I'm probably going to agree with the academic. But to go back to the first question, I think Min Aung Hlaing saw an opportunity and he took it. I think there was always a question that the military would try to take power. It was just a question of when, not if. And I think the idea, even among U.S. policymakers, was to try to strengthen as much the democratic movement as possible, to instill that experience. I mean, it sounds like you're setting up lambs for slaughter in some ways. But to get things as solidified as possible, like the economy, education, health, government capacity, so that when it is taken away, it can't so easily be put back in a box. And that hopefully this isn't going to be like 1962, where we have just decades of darkness, and that the return can come back faster. Once you have a coup in a country, it sets a precedent, no matter how far away it is. Thailand is a great example. Yeah. And I think that's true in Myanmar. I mean, I think we had an understanding. When I say we, in this case, I mean other Burma watchers, that, the military put up with this for 10 years. I mean, they really had 5 years of being more out of power than before. I mean, the USDP did its own thing, certainly. But, they still had military's best interests in mind. Most of them, anyway. So there was never a good transition for the military from being out of power for so long to not being. And yes, do they still control big levers and, an outsized role? Of course. But it was smaller than before. If you look at the transition from a military government in Indonesia, it took a long time, somewhat like 30 years or so. And then it took the 1999 protests that ousted Suharto, and it was dicey for a while. But it took Indonesia that long to get there, and they will say themselves, they breathe a sigh of relief after every election and when a new government sits. We are 23 years now. It's not long enough for them. And the hijinks with Prabowo in the last election, I think, really terrified a lot of people. And I think if you look across Southeast Asia, there are some concerns there. So, Myanmar is part of a trend of backsliding that's global. And so it's also, maybe they have great timing now, but you start to see opportunities. And Min Aung Hlaing's not the dumbest person, so he can see how countries are treated. I think he made some significant miscalculations here.
Right.
Thailand can almost get away with a coup because everyone's so damn used to it. But they have certain things that are fairly stable, and they also have a much stronger economy than Myanmar could ever hope and dream at this point. So, no one's just going to be like, oh, good, stability. We can still invest. I think he totally miscalculated. That really just had no sense. And Prayut isn't the most worldly, so, what's he going to tell Min Aung Hlaing that's of any use besides this is how you take power? So, the NLD was taking risks. The state counselor bill, I think, was a huge shot across their bow, and they absolutely were not happy with that and felt sideswiped by it.
Yeah.
Kony was basically the person that got that through, whether or not that was how he got killed. I'm sure it was a factor. So you start seeing this, and you start seeing the NLD talk a little bit more about constitutional reform. And I think that's also why you saw then the balance on the other side with Aung San Suu Kyi going to The Hague to defend the military's actions and doing others saying, talking about her father's connections to the military, trying to keep that balance, but perhaps she just focused on the wrong things that didn't matter to the military, in fact. But it had to happen at some time, these constitutional reforms and just these reforms in general, civilian control of the military. But how do you do that? And I don't think that the NLD government had great tools for it. I don't think any of us had a good answer. And I think what also didn't help there is that talking about any military engagement was a third rail. Congress would have massacred any politically appointed person, basically would have ended their career if they had done something like that wasn't predominantly human rights focused. Again, there's a lot of space between on mill where it doesn't result immediately in making them better killers. There's a gazillion things you can go in, and some examples that you can think of is training on disaster relief and humanitarian assistance, especially with climate change and the storms. Similar to what we have here, the Army Corps of Engineers. There are other things that you can do. Rewriting the Army Field Manual that no longer incorporates the 4 cuts. It's things like that. The military has to come to the table too, and certainly they weren't always keen to do so. So there was these little things that, I think made Min Aung Hlaing angry, and others as well. And he had to look at the calendar himself. Technically, he was supposed to retire at 60, and there's probably no way he was ever going to be elected president. The military is still always shocked, and it shocks me that they're shocked that they keep losing elections. It's like, no one knows, dude.
Yeah.
You've lost all the time. So you had that, and then you had an election happening at the same time in a little country called the United States. And Donald J. Trump starts going on and on about rigged elections and fraudulent votes and this and that. And the Democrats were doing this. We all know the story. I highly recommend the January 6th trial hearings. Fascinating, but I think also a fascinating look into almost a reconciliation process, but, democracy and the balance. And who is saying the same thing? Min Aung Hlaing. And he starts rattling his saber in January. And then we have the January 6th debacle, insurrection here. And, Donald Trump pretty much gets away with it. He doesn't overthrow the government successfully, thank goodness. But he's not in jail. He's not being put on trial. We're almost a year and a half from it, and really only now digging into it. There's a whole political party that's and several others and tons of voters that still don't see what the big deal is. But that sends a very interesting message to Min Aung Hlaing. And 3 weeks later, I'm not saying that January 6th was the direct line, but it certainly didn't help. And what leg can the U.S. stand on to condemn them? And the UK is a disaster. And, you have all these other European countries too that are dealing with their own far-right factions and anti-democratic folks. It's a dangerous time. And so in some ways, that's why I say I think Min Lang saw an opportunity and took it. But I think he miscalculated like what he was getting into, and I don't think he has the broad support that like a Than Shwe or Sam Maung didn't really have a lot of support either, but that other leaders did. So I think he's in a lot more trouble. But and some of the steps he's taking, I'm like, you really want to get killed in your sleep, don't you? I mean, the executions and just the callousness. I mean, when you have Cambodia lecturing you about your human rights abuses, you have a real problem on your hands. I mean, he's pissing off everybody, but I really think that the U.S. is partly to blame for this, whether it's our lack of engagement with the military, which I know is super controversial, and I could spend hours talking about the nuances behind what I mean there. So let me be clear about that. But and I think our own actions, we're not a leader on this. We need to be an example, and we're not. And it's just striking that the same people that defended Donald Trump on this, not defended, but at least let it slide, are the same people that are calling for democracy in Myanmar. And you even had Mike Flynn at a QAnon conference say, get asked, don't you want what happened in Myanmar happen here? And he's like, yeah. I mean, good Lord. It's very frightening.
Yeah. So I'm being conscious of your time. I just have one question left to leave you with on the coup, and just really appreciate all the time you've taken to dissect your many years of experience and analysis, looking at historically at the previous periods of democratic attempts, specifically in 2007 and 1988 to 1990. One way to look at these past attempts, one interpretation is that these failed, that these were attempts to try to overthrow a military regime and try to bring democracy and human rights, and they did not succeed. And this current attempt is another opportunity to try to succeed where the others failed. And let's see if they can rewrite the history and to do things differently this time. There are other ways to look at this, however, and as the resistance has developed, I've been educated to these other different kinds of interpretations. You actually give a different interpretation in your book. You talk about how not so much seeing these past years as failures, and this one is following the pattern. This might be a failure too, or maybe it can do things a different way, but you see them as lessons. You write them as they are past experiences to draw upon and to learn from. And this reminds me of, I have a friend who's a Burmese friend who's a documentarian, and his father was very involved in the 1988 period, and he's very involved in this period. And so he's not only involved himself, but he has this family institutional history of what they went through. And in talking to him, he was very strong in his belief that it's really inaccurate to say that 1988 or 2007 failed, and that instead it should be seen as it was an attempt that went as far as it could to that point, and that what happened in those years laid the groundwork for what can happen now, and that it showed what's possible and how to do it and how to learn from mistakes in the past, as you said, but that he was very adamant that it is very wrong to see 88 and 07 as failures. There are more parts of the history that are leading to this present moment. So I'm wondering your thoughts on trying to discern the meaning and the purpose of 1988 and 2007 looked at in 2022. And of course, looked at, in 2032 or another year, it's going to look differently, but looked at in this present moment as we're trying to understand the purpose and the value of these moments, and especially how they're relevant to today. Historically, how do you look at and how do you understand what these events mean towards what we're facing now?
I would agree with your friend. I think, and I agree with my analysis in the book as well, that these are lessons. I don't see them as failures either. I mean, did they succeed in getting democracy? No. But did they succeed in getting their cause recognized by the world, like a Southeast Asian nation that like no one can even pronounce the name? People know about it. And that's important. Laying the groundwork. I mean, if you don't have an opposition to this type of government, like it is 1984, then there's no hope. I haven't really thought of this question in a way, so I think I'll be rambling a little bit or speaking to think here.
Sure.
But I also don't see it. I mean, what you do is you keep getting new generations of people interested in, and then they bring in their tools and their thoughts and their experiences. What we didn't have in 2007 or 1988 is like the Milk Tea Alliance. You have Hong Kong, Taiwan, I guess India is part of that as well, Myanmar and Thailand, and like having them kind of commiserate with each other, but also learn from each other. I mean, the way that the young activists after the coup were so dazzlingly effective in getting the message out, maintaining the momentum. Again, it's so easy for me to say as I'm, comfortably sitting in my apartment. But the creativity and like the devastating ways they were able to just run circles around Min Aung Hlaing. Now they were outgunned, but they learned from Hong Kong. They learned from others. Ukraine is learning from Myanmar and from Hong Kong. And I'm not saying this is a great trend because they're fighting, awful, anti-democratic forces and invasions. But if anything, it also focuses, I think, getting to your friend's point, it lays bare what the problems were that you can't kind of kick down the road and say, well, once we fix this, then we can get to the other stuff next. We just have to make sure that the NLD stays in power. No. Now everybody knows that the sectarian issues are real and problematic and institutional, that ethnic groups dealt with a hell of a lot more than any of the majority Bamar, and there's a lot more empathy there. That folks, the new generations don't think that, the 88 generation are old and, they just need to get over it already. This is new. And it kind of reminds me of, younger generations here yelling at people, Vietnam vets saying, oh, there's no lessons learned. Every day there's a lesson learned there. To the point where hopefully history doesn't repeat or rhyme. It's different. I sincerely hope that we're not having the same conversation 20 years from now saying, well, if only the military released political prisoners and Aung San Suu Kyi and let the 2020 results be recognized. I mean, that's the most depressing part of that, but I don't see that. Hopefully the days are dark for sure. And the recent executions of a well-known 88 generation student activist, Ko Jimmy, an lawmaker and hip-hop artist, Phyo Zeo Tha, and the other two that were executed along with them. Boy, that really hurts a lot. And then the saber rattling on executing more. I mean, I just wouldn't be surprised if we see a lot more folks. And, I think there's a question over what about some of the other folks that we knew that were in government? I don't know. So nothing has failed yet. And I don't see 88 as a failure as well, because look how we're celebrating the life of Ko Jimmy and how he's inspiring everybody. I mean, he's a martyr, and all these people are making ultimate sacrifices that I hope I never have to. So, these are dark times, but with that brief democratic experience in the most recent of memories, it is really hard to put that in the box. And I think, it's our responsibility to help it grow and thrive. I'm not sure if that means arming the opposition or whatnot, but there are ways. So hopefully these dark days don't last much longer.
Well, thank you. That was a very full conversation, and thank you for bringing your depth and breadth of analysis to it. And again, your book is Burmese Haze. Recommend that to all listeners to check out to go into more depth of these issues. And thanks so much for taking the time to join us for this extended conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. And thanks to the listeners for tuning in. If you read the book, I hope you enjoy it. But I think we have a lot of work to do going forward.
We'd like to take this time to thank our generous supporters who have already given. We simply cannot continue to provide you with this content and information without the wonderful support of generous listeners, donors, and friends like you. Each episode helps in providing access to one more voice, one more perspective, one more insight. Every donation of any size is greatly appreciated, and it helps us to continue this mission. We greatly appreciate your generosity, which allows us to maintain this platform and everything else we do. If you would like to join in our mission to support those in Myanmar who are being impacted by the military coup, we welcome your contribution in any form, currency, or transfer method. Your donation will go to support a wide range of humanitarian missions, aiding those local communities who need it most. Donations are directed to such causes as the Civil Disobedience Movement, CDM, families of deceased victims, internally displaced person, IDP camps, food for impoverished communities, military defection campaigns, undercover journalists, monasteries and nunneries, education initiatives, the purchasing of protective equipment and medical supplies, COVID relief, and much more. We also make sure that our donation fund supports a diverse range of religious and ethnic groups across the country. We invite you to visit our website to learn more about past projects as well as upcoming needs. You can give a general donation or earmark your contribution for a specific activity or project you would like to support, perhaps even something you heard about in this very episode. All of this humanitarian aid work is carried out by our nonprofit mission, Better Burma. Any donation you give on our Insight Myanmar website is directed towards this fund. Alternatively, you can also visit the Better Burma website, betterburma.org. That's BETTERBURMA.org. and donate directly there. In either case, your donation goes to the same cause, and both websites accept credit cards. You can also give via PayPal by going to paypal.me/betterburma. Additionally, we take donations through Patreon, Venmo, GoFundMe, and Cash App. Simply search Better Burma on each platform and you'll find our account. You can also visit either the Insight Myanmar or Better Burma websites for specific links to those respective accounts, or email us at info@betterburma.org. If you'd like to give in another way, please contact us. Thank you so much for your kind consideration and support.